Welcome back to episode 12 of Fit with Mitch. Strength and conditioning coach Mitch Freeburn here. On this week's episode, we're going to talk about the adductor complex and how it relates to the sport of hockey, how it absorbs force, creates force, and what that actually does for our athlete. So one thing in hockey, we think of the skating stride as that leg extends away and laterally from that body. What muscle's on the inside? The muscle is that adductor complex, and it's absorbing those eccentric forces from the big, powerful concentric output of driving that foot away from the body. First things first, with any injury, there is a spectrum that the adductor complex can actually fall to. You can start with what we'll call a grade 1 or a simple tweak or pull, ranging at the far end of the extreme to the complete rupture, which then usually requires surgery or more in-depth medical intervention. What we're going to focus on today is that lower grade pull where the muscle is still intact, but some of the fibers as a result of that trauma and that force output have been stretched, and then resulting damage occurs. Using our example of the goalie, what we're talking about and what usually causes that injury is that eccentric load. So picking example, when I move from my right to my left, I'm having that heavy lateral push off my right leg, and then I'm absorbing force with my left leg, usually with that straight eccentric loading, placing force on that groin, which then the body ultimately can't sustain, and there we have our injury. Now moving into the content part of this episode. The injury's now occurred. The athlete has started with our medical staff, and the first thing that we like to let the athlete do is, depending on the severity of the injury, you have to give them time. You have to let the body work through that inflammatory process before we even start working, because when an injury happens, the body produces inflammation to protect itself. If we start trying to force that athlete through different ranges, the body is going to simply guard against us, and we're not going to get an overall productive workload. Once the body has started to relax, we can then start to establish length, see where that athlete is at, where we can get that leg deviating away from the body before we create enough tension that causes an elevation of pain. As we progress to a certain level, when we get pain, that's okay. What we want to see where they're at is then when we let off that tension, we bring that leg back towards the body. Does that pain subside and that intensity go down? From there, we can then start building that tolerance, and progressively, day after day, week after week, depending on the severity, we can work away from that comfort zone and force that groin, that adductor complex, to create force, stabilize in larger ranges as we progress that athlete back towards a normal functional movement. As I briefly touched on at the start of the episode, there's different types of muscular force. We have concentric action. Concentric action is when the muscle produces force as we shorten it. For example, a bicep curl. We have an isometric, where we've shot in a previous episode doing that sprinter push against the wall. That wall isn't moving, so we are isometrically producing force. And then lastly, which was the etiology of how our injury occurred, was that eccentric force. So that muscle is producing force as it lengthens or in an overall lengthened state. Relating simply to our example we've created here for our adductor complex injury, we want to start with what we can control the best. So that is the form of an isometric. In an isometric, we're not changing length. So the athlete or the therapist or the coach can modulate the amount of force based on how that athlete is feeling and what those tissues can sustain. We'll overlay some examples of what I mean here, but what we want to do is, like I said, we want to establish that baseline to work on. We do that through an isometric, and then we'll progressively add layers of complexity and increase challenge as that athlete progresses. After an isometric, we want to go to a concentric action. Again, we can make this as easy or as complex as we want, but what we're doing is we're trying to teach that adductor complex that it's okay to produce force. It's okay to lengthen and then contract and shorten again. Finally, once the athlete can produce force at a constant length, and then move through a range of motion, we can get to our most physically taxing and demanding, and that's that eccentric load, or those movements that cause the injury to occur in the first place. What we want to really pay attention with here is working with our medical staff, working with the athlete, truly ensure that they are ready for this tolerance, so that way when we go to execute the movements, produce the force, they believe in themselves and they can effectively communicate and perform the movement without any hesitation or hindrance that they might injure themselves again producing this force. At some point in an athlete's life, if they're playing the sport of hockey, no matter where they are on the scale from recreational to professional, that skating stride in that body, pushing that foot forcefully away, that eccentric load on the groin is going to cause, at some point or another, a good likelihood that there's going to be an injury on somewhere on that scale from a basic strain to that complete rupture. What we're trying to do through the off-ice program is we're trying to give that groin and that adductor complex multiple different looks and exercises using the isometric, concentric, eccentric stressors to increase the overall strength and functionality of that muscle group to then decrease the likelihood of those injuries occurring. Unfortunately, when an athlete does injure some form or variant of that adductor complex, no matter how hard they try after, the subsequent risk of another injury has been elevated. So you can just see the direct correlation and the importance of staying on multiple things. First of all, your isolated strengthening of that 3D hip strength, which we've discussed before. Number two, overall just mobility, ability to get in and out of certain positions, expanding more beyond just specific ones you see out on the ice. Ensuring the body can move, get in and out of positions is really important. It's that first step to then make sure that we can accept the load and the tolerance that the sport demands of us. And then the last thing, being on the professional spectrum, if you're in the American League, 72 games, playing the National League, 82 games, with travel, with back-to-back, a very high volume of on ice, so you can imagine the amount of force that goes through that adductor complex throughout the course of a season. Younger athletes really struggle when they first break into the league, and as they get older, you create what's called a professional routine. That routine becomes really important. It allows, what we're trying to establish is that as close to a neutral state as possible. Throughout the season, bodies break down, and from that repetitive force, interaction with others. But what we want to try and establish is that professional routine. We can try and reset as close to ground zero as we can, and then depending on our schedule, we can use the time on the off-ice component to build strength, maintain mobility, to create as much force and resilience of that hip joint and that overall athlete to keep them on the ice, producing force and doing what they ultimately want to do for the game of hockey is win. I hope you really pulled something from this episode this week, and stay tuned next week to see what's going on with Fit with Mitch.